Reading is just a habit you gotta form in all life. Books don't change people's sentences.
Reading good, solid, reformed, Puritan literature, reading especially the classics, that's had the biggest impact on my life.
Well, g'day and welcome to another episode of the Reformers Bookcast. My name is Tom Eglinton. I'm the manager here at Reformers, and today we are joined to chat about books by James Jeffery.
Yep. Thanks so much, Tom, for having me. It's great to be here again. Love these conversations. Yeah.
Very good. Yes, and like you say, you've been here before. But for those who haven't heard about you, why don't you tell us just the 30-second bio?
Sure, yeah. I'm 25 years old, in my third year of college at Christ College in Burwood. I've got a wife named Zenny, who I love very much, and a young daughter, and we've got our second one coming on the way now. So,
Fantastic.
Yeah.
That's good. Now, we are here to talk about books that are about social media, the internet, communication, these sorts of things. I know you've been doing a bunch of reading on it lately. I've been reading on it for a while, and so hopefully we can have an enjoyable conversation about it. But let's start with the lay of the land. What books are out there on these topics?
There's a lot, so it's hard to discern what to read, how to find the quality stuff to get into. The ones that I have been most profoundly influenced by, I'd say, are The Next Story by Tim Challies. There's one released maybe 10 years ago. It's gone through a couple of revised editions, I think. That's sort of the staple work. Competing Spectacles by Tony Reinke, and also 12 Ways Your Phone is Changing You. They're sort of more recent ones, but they've been the biggest influences, I'd say, on my own walk with Christ, yeah.
Yeah, and how would you describe the differences between those books? Which ones help with which sort of things?
The Next Story tackles the issue of the internet and the whole digital revolution, the .com sort of boom, everything that comes with all of this new technology. And Tim Challies just goes, well, these are new technologies which give us the capacity to do things we've never done before, for good and for evil. And so we need to be really discerning, thoughtful Christians when we approach these platforms in order to bring them under the lordship of Christ. Whereas the other two books, Competing Spectacles and 12 Ways Your Phone is Changing You, they're more specifically on the topics of social media and more recent forms of technology in the last, say, 10 years and how they've revolutionized, especially the younger generation and how they engage together and communicate and network, all that sort of thing.
Yeah, the way I describe the difference between those two is 12 Ways Your Phone is Changing You is about the device and what the fact of having that device does to you, and the Competing Spectacles is about the content that gets fed to you through the device, particularly through social media.
Yeah, exactly. And the key thesis, I guess, of Tony Reinke and 12 Ways Your Phone is Changing You is your phone your master, or are you the master of your phone? And it really digs deep into some of those heart issues, which are sometimes confronting, but nevertheless helpful and really refining and sanctifying.
Yeah. Those itches you get to check.
Yeah.
Notifications.
There's that function on screen time on iPhone where you can now check how many times you pick up your phone every day, and you just don't really want to look at it because it's
I don't use an iPhone, I use an Android, but I installed an app that does the screen time tracking, and it just gives you a little overview each day.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, today you used it for 3 hours. Well, 3 hours. You just,
thank goodness.
what was I doing?
I hope that was on the ESV Bible application.
Well, that's the thing, because if you're listening to stuff on YouTube, that'll sit there and it'll record that as screen time.
100%,
yeah, it does depend on what you use it for. Okay, so let's think about this in a couple of sort of systematic ways. Let's start with the concept of the internet. What does the internet do for us? How does it shape? How is it so vastly different to the way that people have dealt with things in the past?
Yeah.
What's the good? What's the bad?
For sure, yeah. Well, the internet is really just a communication network which enables people to connect all over the world. So the internet is not something out there. Anyone who is using the internet is part of the internet. And so it's really just an extension of our social relationships, using a technology to engage with one another. And so in that sense, there's nothing new about the internet in one sense, but in another sense, it's enabled human connections, at least digital connections, on a scale we've never seen in the world before. So it's a revolutionary technology, comes with enormous benefits, enormous dangers as well, inevitably. One of those great shifts has been the shift towards anonymity, pulling back and using the internet as almost a sphere in which we're not accountable in the same way we would be in the real world, even though in reality there is no distinction between those two spheres.
Yeah, it is interesting, isn't it? We like to distinguish between the real world when we're talking face to face, and then whatever the internet is, but you say it is part of the real world, so you have to really be discerning as to what you're actually doing there. Charlie's in the next story, he breaks it down into two categories. He talks about how the internet's facilitated communication, which we'll talk about, I think, in a minute. And you mentioned it's connecting people, but it also does something about our information. Which actually, I'll mention another book that's really useful. I don't know if you've read this one. It's called The Wisdom Pyramid by
No, I haven't read
Brett
that
McCracken.
one.
It's a new one where he sort of engages with the information side of the internet. Did you pick up anything from Charlie's in particular around the information that got you thinking about how you process?
I remember reading specifically Charlie's addressing the issue of information overload, that we are just receiving too much information now, whether that's the depressing news all around the world of hearing tragedies happen, which we don't have the emotional capacity to regulate and to process, to just the sheer amount of information on world news, theology, worldview stuff. It's just suffocating at times. And so that's one of the great challenges is how do we process this information? How do we discern what to read, how to read it, and what to access? Those sort of questions are really important.
And it really places us in this place that historically has not been the situation of mankind, which is that we're now passionately interested in the day-to-day details of what happens in the Ukraine or in the US, or and we're reading article after article after article and watching video after video about the details of what happened yesterday in these faraway places, and because we're limited people, I'm a mere man. I can be awake for maybe 16 hours a day, that sort of thing. It consumes our time and energy and focus.
You can't keep up with everything.
It's impossible, right? That's what you're talking about, the overload. And what it does is it's a trade-off. It's always a trade-off. Every minute that we spend doing something is a minute that we don't spend doing something else.
That's right.
And so the question is, we're passionately involved day after day in all these events that are going on in the nether regions of the world. What are we missing?
Yeah. And whereas God has placed us in a specific place with specific people around us, with our family and with our church and with our city and then with our nation, and oftentimes we neglect those spheres in order to chase this unattainable knowledge of what's going on in the world, which will be out of date the next day. We'll try and be an expert in everything whilst really being a generalist and having a knowledge that's very shallow, especially of those most close to us, those whom we are actually responsible to care for. Yeah. It's a big temptation.
As you've thought about that, has that shifted how you behave? What sort of things you read about? And
for sure, yeah. Like I'm not a perfect example in this way. I sometimes get caught up. I sometimes get caught up in a lot of world affairs, and it's so easy to go down the rabbit hole and to just get swept away by it. And there's been times where I realized, wow, this is consuming more family time than it ought to be. So I think putting those big rocks in place of like family worship and, reading my Bible in the morning, those sort of things, so that the other things can find a place if there's time later and if there's energy. But if I'm neglecting these primary responsibilities, then the rest is in vain, really. So it's been probably a process of me realizing that before God, and God being very patient with me and growing me over time, yeah.
Yeah, so that's sort of to do with the locational aspect of information, whereas, in past generations you'd have to send a letter and that would have to get into a newspaper and those sorts of things in order to transmit data or information over long distances. Now you can watch live stream what's going on. What about the sort of scope of information that we have access to now?
You can get information on basically anything now, can't you? Which is both terrifying and amazing. Biblical training and education is now available to people in the most remote parts of the world because of the internet. And so got to praise God for that and
Absolutely.
and worship Him and just say, wow, this is a time where you can really foresee the word of the Lord actually going to all nations. In previous times in history, maybe not so much, but now you can see it. At the same time, there's an article I read that said every time you use the internet, think of the internet as not only a doorway to the best content in the world, but it's also the doorway to an X-rated shop. And so it is an incredibly dangerous place as well, because within a couple of taps or clicks, you can be in the darkest places you'd ever imagined. And so it's really, it's a sphere in which I think a lot of discernment needs to be exercised, because the potential for benefit is great, but also the potential for danger is even greater.
Yeah, like there's incredible things on the internet, like Project Gutenberg would be an example that sort of comes to mind, where you've got someone who's put together all these classic works that are out of copyright that you can access for free.
It's phenomenal, isn't it?
It's just insane. And like you said, seminaries and sharing information.
Kindle, Amazon Kindle is just amazing. Being able to access, literally any book for most of them under $10 is just incredible.
We don't like Amazon though.
Yeah. Shop at Reformers Bookstore. That's where you want to get your books at. But Amazon, these websites enable information transfer of some of the best stuff on a scale we've never seen before, which is just an incredible opportunity.
Yeah, that's exactly. I mean, and we use the internet at Reformers. We ship books all over Australia, all over New Zealand, some parts of the world to buy from us, and that's all facilitated by the internet.
And so it's like you get the printing press in the 1500s, and then you get the internet in the 2000s, and these things just merge together, and you got Reformers Bookstore and exporting excellent resources, right?
So, talk to me about the difference between, I guess, blogs and books.
Yeah. Well, blogs are shorter than books. It's probably the best way to put it to start with. They're usually sound bites. They're usually someone's initial thoughts or reflections. Some blogs are really good. Some aren't so good. Generally, if you've published a book these days, it requires a lot of thought. It requires an editing process. It requires a significantly larger amount of content to produce. And so someone who writes a book has generally thought about a topic probably more than someone who's written a blog. And so you're going to get the gems really in written books most of the time. That said, there are some helpful blogs. I think following reputable sites and reputable blogs can be a beneficial way of getting information and getting encouragement, etc. But I think, books are unparalleled for those reasons, I think. Yeah.
Although I think it's interesting, even that has shifted in recent days with books, because you can self-publish books. So I often talk to people about the difference between a self-published book and a book put through a publisher, because a publishing company puts the books through the paces. It typically takes 12 to 24 months to publish a book through a publisher, because they're editing it, they're asking the authors questions about exactly what they mean. They're questioning things as they go.
There's a cross-examination going on that just isn't. And blogs, information in blogs can spread like wildfire. It's like news headlines. They can spread like wildfire online, even if they're not true. Whereas the editing process for a lot of these companies, is pretty thorough. Yeah, especially for companies like Crossway and Reformation Heritage and those sort of companies. Put a lot of effort into that.
So then, just while we're on the topic, and because I like books, and I know you like books, the internet sort of brought this immediacy of fast-moving, large amounts of content. Like if you were to follow some of the more reputable blogs, you still couldn't read all the stuff they write. So talk to me about the difference between new books and old books.
Not all new books are good, and not all old books are good or bad, depending on what they are. But there are a lot of works that were written in history which I think are quality and which we're missing out on. The Puritan classics are probably some of the biggest influences on my own walk over the past couple of years, which I've realized there's a gold mine out there and I haven't even noticed it. They're getting republished, which I praise God for, and I'm thankful to various publishing companies for getting this stuff back in the mainstream. I find that a lot of new books are sort of, this might be a bit of a caricature, but it's like, 10 ways to change the world, or 12 things, or 40 things or whatever it is. Whereas the Puritan classics target one specific issue in depth, go hard at it, look at it from a biblical perspective, do some deep soul searching, that sort of stuff. That said, though, there are some contemporary books that weave together Puritan themes and thoughts and repackage them to a contemporary audience that's really accessible. And so one of the ones that I have been reading recently is Knowing Sin by Mark Jones, as an example. So there are good on both ends of the spectrum. I think it just requires discernment, given just how much there is.
Yeah.
And the fact that we just don't have time to read everything. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I think Lewis said somewhere that I can't remember the ratio, but you should read old and new books.
Yeah. I think there was a quote I read recently in a book called Understanding Family Worship by Terry L. Johnson. And he said that one of the best ways to see your blind spots as an individual and culturally is to read books from another generation, because you'll see things that you just wouldn't see otherwise, and you'll see things that the scriptures address, like that God addresses through His Word, that we are completely negligent of just because we have never thought in that way. So I think it's humbling. It's a process that's edifying, and like Spurgeon says, if we don't read books, we'll never actually learn. We'll never be read. We'll never be quoted, because we need to learn before we can ever produce and that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's good. And here's another aspect of the difference. But so on the internet, there's a trend to moving from blogs to audio or even visual videos, like say a podcast, for instance. Who would do one of those? And one of the things I found interesting as I've sort of consumed content via different methods is when you are listening to a book or when you are watching a video, you don't typically hit pause. But when you're reading a book, you do. You slow down.
You have time to meditate, just process, and I'm going to stop there for today. That's enough to dwell on and like that. Yeah. Fill your mind for the rest of the day, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that sort of thing. Or even just pause for a few moments while you think about that sentence, or go back and think about it again. Yeah.
And you can flick through the book as well and go, well, I think I read something on that earlier, and I'm going to go back to that because I don't quite understand the connection there and that sort of thing.
Yeah. So anyway, there's some things to think about. Let's talk about social media. A number of these books discuss social media as well. I think the Competing Spectacles is probably the highlight in that regard. Do you want to give us a definition of social media?
Yeah. There was a helpful definition I saw that said that any social media is any medium which allows you to connect socially with others on a digital platform to distribute content or create networks between people. So in a sense, it's a very broad definition. Specifically, there's a lot of different social media platforms which enable social media to occur. But that's probably the broad vision of what social media is in our age today.
Yeah. So your typical examples here: Facebook, Instagram, TikTok now, and it's this interesting place where you go to see what other people say. Or at least that's the perception of it.
Yeah.
And this is something I find interesting about the whole thing, is because if you start looking into what drives these companies, why does Facebook do what it does? Well, in the fourth quarter of last year, Facebook brought in something like $32 billion in ad revenue. And that was their main, that was like, I think there was $1 billion of other revenue. That was their revenue, is ad revenue. So they're a business and they're selling something to make money. What are they selling? What's their product?
There's a good distinction between a company that sells hardware and a company that basically sells your data. So if they're not selling a tangible product, like say Apple, which is selling computers, iPhones, iPads, if it doesn't cost anything to use a service, you probably are the service that
you're the product.
Yeah, you're the
that's
product.
Right, and that's how I describe it. What they're selling, and it's not even you that they're selling. They're selling your attention.
Yeah. Yep, and I think that they're tapping into some of the deepest longings of the human heart, some of the darker lusts of the human heart, and they are actively, these social media companies know this, they're actively presenting information to you and advertising which will satisfy the lusts of the flesh a lot of the time, whether that's pride or sexual immorality or greed or whatever it is. They understand what drives the human heart, and they feed it constantly, and we become addicted to it, and then we become the slave of these platforms a lot of the time.
That's exactly right. And they've got Facebook, for instance, is spending a good portion of that $32 billion that they earn in one quarter. Like, it's just astonishing amounts of money, perfecting the art of keeping your attention on the screen.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is why, that experience I'm sure everyone's had of, I'll just check my Facebook feed. And then, you see it. What have I been doing for 2 hours? Yeah. And you literally can't even remember what you've been looking at.
Yeah.
It's just some video, and then something else pops up, and
although we're not intentionally using these platforms necessarily to use it for say 2 hours, Facebook knows exactly what they're doing. They're not idiots.
That's exactly right.
There was a Wall Street Journal article recently that was addressing Instagram, and Facebook owns Instagram. So Instagram is objectively toxic to teenage girls in terms of body image, in terms of their sexuality, all that sort of stuff. It's objectively poor for their mental health, depression, etc. And yet, nothing really changes with the platform. It just keeps rolling, and people keep using it. But it just seems as though it doesn't matter, even though there's evidence on these things.
Yeah, and Tony Reinke's book, Competing Spectacles, I think is unsurpassed for sort of getting an idea of what is actually happening to you. Basically, the premise of the book is we're designed to look at things. We're designed to be captivated by beauty, by things that are interesting, by things that attract us with some of our desires.
It's a really good thing, isn't it? The God's made us that way.
It's amazing. It's why I'm attracted to my wife,
Exactly, yeah. And praise God for that, yeah.
And yet our sinful nature perverts that, and big businesses who make a lot of money off our attention utilize that inbuilt drive and our sinful nature to essentially just keep our eyes on the screen.
Yeah. They take away the gaze from what is actually beautiful to that which is cheap, and that which is valuable to that which is completely useless.
Yes.
But it's a quick fix. I think the social media companies are aware of this, whether it's the videos feed on Facebook that just has junk constantly, or whether it's whatever platform it is. They're very aware of this.
Yeah.
What goes on in our minds.
Yeah. And he, of course, connects that to the fact that we are supposed to have our eyes fixed on God and be captivated by the spectacle that he is, and then everything sort of cascades down from that. So the beauty that we should enjoy in this world is things that honor him and honor his glory. So the nature that he's made, or the things that align with truth.
And that's a really important point, because even if we ran away from these platforms entirely because we're just like there's so much bad stuff there, unless we are captured by a better vision. There's a book by Heath Lambert on this specific thing for pornography and the struggle with that many are having. Unless we're captured by a better vision, that void will be filled by something else. And so it's so important when we think about these platforms to think, how am I being captivated by the glory of Christ and about his beauty and his majesty and the ways at which he's at work, even in the creation, or is it drawing me elsewhere?
And that book by Heath Lambert is called Captured by a Better Vision, is it?
Yeah, literally, yeah.
Cool. Now, I think one of the things that's really vital in our particular day and age is you and I, you're around 30 odd years old, are you?
25 still. So.
Yeah, you're joking.
Yeah,
halfway
through the 20s.
Mate,
yeah,
well done. All right,
get in there. Yeah, I'll catch up to you someday.
Anyway, 25, 30 years old. We've grown up. Like, do you remember before social media?
Yes, I do. I remember when the smartphone became a thing in about 2008 sort of period. But it was revolutionary. I mean, I remember the day when people used to take brick phones to school.
The old Nokia, and you play Snake on it.
Yeah, play Snake on the way to school on the bus. But with the invention of the smartphone, that seemed to transform everything, didn't it?
Yeah. But my point though is we saw the transition. So you and I know roughly what life could be like without these things.
It is possible,
and we can. And more to the point, we can see some of the differences. My kids, a 15-year-old today, a 10-year-old today, they know nothing but smartphones and nothing but social media and nothing but the internet. I just can't emphasize, like if you're a parent listening, I cannot emphasize enough how much you need to read some of these books.
Yeah.
Like start with The Next Story.
Yeah.
Get on to some of Tony Reinke.
Inevitably, our children will be ahead of us with technologies because they're growing up with them and assume them.
That's right.
So we need to be ahead of the game in terms of knowing what they're capable of, knowing what they can do, and knowing the dangers that they pose, not only to us, but our children as well.
Yeah, and we need to be able to train our kids in these things because that's how life works. Life works by kids being trained by the parents, as an emphasis, and by other trusted adults around that.
It's not the school's responsibility. It's not the church's responsibility. It's our responsibility as parents ultimately, and then anything else is just supplementary.
That's correct. But either way, it's generational teaching, and if we've got this weird situation where one generation of parents doesn't have potentially the same sort of understanding as the kids, and the kids need to be taught how to use social media, how to use the internet, how to use phones.
Right, yeah.
Because they're amazing tools, like we've been saying, but we need to use them right.
That's right. Yeah, I was listening to a podcast by Doug Wilson, who's I think he's a great pastor, but he said recently, you don't need to teach your kids to be evil. They will just do it naturally. What you need to teach them is to how to manage these sinful desires and emotions and thoughts, and actually submit them to the glory of God and follow in the footsteps of Christ, our Savior. And that's not something that comes naturally. In fact, if we don't do anything, the inevitable result is just straying away and just destroying ourselves. So it requires a great degree of intentionality and actual thoughtful discernment in order to do this well. Yeah.
We're going to return to one of the topics we mentioned at the start, which is communication. Because the internet, social media, phones, these technologies, they have done something to our communication. What have they done to our communication, and what does it mean for us?
Yeah, in a sense, there's always been forms of non-verbal, non-face-to-face communication. We even see it in the New Testament, where Paul writes to the churches, but he says, "I'm going to tell you some things. I'm not going to tell you now in the letters. I'm going to tell you when I come to visit you."
Yep.
And the Apostle John says, in his first epistle, I don't want to say any more because I want to meet you face to face, and I want the joy to be filled when we're actually in that face-to-face communion, that incarnate relationship. So non-face-to-face, non-verbal communication is not bad, but it's very limited, especially when it comes to things like conflict resolution, when it comes to sharing deep emotions and deep longings and things that just we don't have the capacity to fully express over say social media or the internet, and in an age where we're so drenched in social media and drenched in text messaging, etc., we can so often substitute those precious conversations or put those precious conversations online, which inevitably creates a lot of miscommunication, a lot of pastoral issues that we wouldn't have had otherwise if we just dealt with it face to face.
Yeah, and Tim Challies' The Next Story is just a masterpiece, I think, in terms of explaining some of those aspects of communication. He talks about how whenever you have an increase in one ability of humanity, you generally have a decrease. It's a trade-off. You have a decrease in something else. So technology, letters, increase our ability to communicate with someone when we're not near them. But there's a loss in the humanity that's communicated. Emails and text messages and social media comments just sort of fall further and further down that chain, and you lose more and more of the humanity of it as you go.
That's right. Yeah, the person you're speaking to becomes an avatar rather than the actual person, and it's so easy to slip into a mode of thinking that's just not biblical. We're not viewing them as the person they are. Yeah,
and that's really. Yeah, so you see that in social media comments all the time. Just jump online and
keyboard warrior.
have a look, and you'll see people really using words they would never use in person, ascribing motive they would never assume in person.
And there's not time to clarify comments or statements. It's like, what do you mean by that? It's just, this is what you said, I'm going to go for it.
Yeah, and to be honest, I kind of get it because like who would want to have a robust conversation on social media comments?
That's right. Yeah.
I really don't understand why we bother trying.
A lot of it is a performance as well, because it's public. It's not on a direct message.
Yeah.
And so there's other people watching, and there's a desire to, I guess, have a little fan base who are, the Michael Jackson meme, eating popcorn. There's people who are doing that on comment threads.
Absolutely.
They're not commenting, but they're just watching. And
Yeah.
I think in our hearts, we want people to be, thumbs up in the comments or whatever it is.
Absolutely.
For the support and for the hubris we have.
Absolutely, we do. Yeah. Yep. And I definitely think there's different types of people, different types of uses of social media. Some people post content. Some people just they're shadow users. You never see them.
Never see them post.
Never see them post. Never see them comment. Never nothing. They just go there to watch.
Yep.
And they're either watching the content or they're watching the comments. And basically, it's like a gladiator fight. We're just we're just enjoying the show.
Back row of the seats, and just
Yeah. And then some people go on. They don't post any content, but they comment on everything. So it's kind of, I think it's interesting to sort of think through that a little bit.
Yeah.
Which we won't do. We'll leave that for others to do.
Yes.
But one of the things I find interesting in terms of communication and how technology has increased our ability to communicate with anyone, anywhere, but decreased some other aspects, is how that relates to Gnosticism, which is an ancient heresy. To us?
Yeah. Gnosticism is the belief that our physical or our spiritual needs to be emphasized to the exclusion of the other. So only our physical body matters, only our spiritual body matters, or our spiritual being matters. And inevitably, either of those perspectives end up underemphasizing the importance of what we do in our physical bodies right now, or overemphasizing it to the extent that the spiritual doesn't matter. Even though in reality, we are a body and a spirit. These two things are deeply connected as made in the image of God. And those two things will be ultimately connected for all eternity once our bodies are raised from the dead on that final day. So I think that the Gnosticism of the digital age is that we think that social networking and communication and friendships in the digital sphere are sufficient to fill the longings of the human heart. I think that's one of the deepest tragedies. And we saw this during the COVID period, where a lot of people were just jumping onto Zoom church, even though they weren't sick, even though they weren't at risk. They just hopped on Zoom church because that was attending church. But I wonder whether the Gnosticism of our age that separates the body and the soul, and spirit, all that sort of thing, was the product of that. The underlying Gnosticism that we don't believe that actually incarnate fellowship, incarnate worship, actually partaking of the sacraments physically matters. We've fallen for this idea that it's sufficient to just be involved in the digital sphere, and yet we're lonely and we're isolated and we are unsatisfied because of it. So it actually hasn't actually satisfied the longing. It's just we believe it can, or it has.
Yeah,
that's what it seems.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting thing to think through, because when you start thinking about what's happening when you're, say, interacting via text message with someone, or interacting on a social media comment, or even via email, or to a slightly lesser extent letters, which I can explain in a second. But what are you really doing? If you think about those distinctions you made, that we are enfleshed souls. Jesus commands us to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. So he sort of says there's all these different aspects to you, three of which are non-physical: heart, soul, mind, and strength. I'm not saying there's four different parts. There's obviously body and soul, but Jesus is sort of saying, well, some of what goes on in you is your mind thinking, and some of what goes on is your affections loving, and some of you is your soul. So you sort of have your thinking and your loving and your truth aspect as well in terms of your soul and morality. But when you're engaging, all the non-physical parts of you are engaging. Yeah, it's basically minds connecting.
Yes, yeah. And you're missing the physicality of being present in a room with someone's undivided attention, with their expressions, which even if we say are on a Zoom call, the milliseconds we're missing between with the delay of the internet, it means a significant amount, even though we're not realizing it. And there's been studies on this, that the miscommunication that goes on online is so much more rife because of the fact that we're not incarnate with each other, chatting face to face. Yeah.
That's fascinating. And I mean, even on a Zoom call, you're actually limited to a little box.
Yeah.
So you don't see, their hand gestures or their body position. There's a whole lot of things.
Exactly.
They can choose to mute themselves, and so there's those aspects as well. But I think it's interesting when you sort of push that down a little and start to think about the implications. What can easily end up happening, and essentially does if you interact via these communication methods as a wholesale method of communication, you're not interacting with another person. You're interacting with their mind, and you're making up what they're like as you go along. And you get that because when someone texts you, you read that in a particular way. You read tone, you read intent, you read motive, you read
That's right.
Speed.
For those people who don't use emojis, or who do use emojis a lot, when they don't send an emoji, it's like something's up. And emojis seem to fill that, to try and fill that gap, even though it can never be filled, because even with emojis, there might be a ha 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 or smiley, even though it's not really all that smiley.
Exactly, and it's a projection of yourself. So not only do we interpret the communication however we decide, unthinkingly, And so I've had this. I've been texting people and I'll have this picture in my mind of who they are, but then you meet them and it's like, what I thought was going on was not going on. What I thought they were like is not who they are.
It's a lot harder to hate someone to their face, right? It's very easy to hate a caricature we've made in our minds and to craft this image. But once we become face to face, there's so much that's clarified, so much miscommunication that's just out the window just because they're face to face.
Yeah.
It's quite incredible.
Yeah, and it goes the other way too. So it's not just input, it's projection. I project a particular thing.
Indeed, yeah. And that's, I guess, one of the dangers of social media is we inevitably project an image which we like and we want people to see. I mean, we wouldn't put up photos online that we don't want people to see. We wouldn't want to put up things about ourselves that are humiliating, because that's just not how we operate as humans. But when we're in person, it's a lot harder to hide our imperfections and our mistakes. And I mean, that's one of the reasons why it's so important to be part of a local church community regularly and accountable, is because they see it all. They see all the imperfections, whereas online it's easy to present an airbrushed image, which is highly different to what is in reality.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And actually, there was something I was talking to a teenager and about these sorts of things about communication, and I was observing they texted a group, and then they were watching who was online while they texted, and then analysing how long it took for people to respond, and judging what they meant by the different I'm just like, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
That's another level. I can't even think that far.
Scene function on messages doesn't help at all with it.
I don't know. Sorry, mate.
When someone messages someone and it says, I've seen the message at this time.
Yes.
And then it's like, well, they need to respond as soon as they see it. Otherwise, if they see it and they don't respond immediately, then they mustn't care about me. And then that must mean they're not my friend, and just jump to conclusions.
Yeah.
Might just be at the kids in the bath. It could be any number of things. Yeah. So again, these are topics that I really think need to be fleshed out more in our lives, particularly I think for kids. And so it's vital for churches, for church leaders to understand these things, for parents to understand these things. And there are, like we mentioned, the great resources out there. I'd start with the next story: 12 Ways of Phone Changing You and Competing Spectacles. Yeah. Wisdom 3
Pyramid.
good books to start with.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, James, it's been an absolute pleasure interacting with you face to face.
As always, Tom. Thanks so much for having me on here. Yeah.
No worries. And you've been listening to the Reformers Bookcast, which you can get wherever you get your bookcasts. And we will see you next time.